yourself to water if you want. Thanks.
Hey, well, kia ora koutou. Thank you very, very much for coming out on what would otherwise be a very nice and sunny Saturday afternoon. If you don't already know me from the wanted posters, I'm Peter Thompson. I'm the chair of the Better Public Media Trust. So I'll be chairing the discussion part of this public meeting. Want to acknowledge Miles Thomas, our director, for setting this up and organising it. Now, the way this is going to work is that I'll say a couple of words and just mention the speakers as they speak in turn. But very briefly, we have Stephen Smith from RNZ, Anna Currie from New Zealand On Air, Mark Jennings from Newsroom, Wayne Hope from AUT, Allan Martin, who's also on our trust board, a former CEO of BCNZ. And we'll also have Michael Stiassny, who's the chair of the Ministerial Advisory Group on broadcasting and digital media. So we have a stellar lineup. I'll just open by saying, of course, Better Public Media has been campaigning for several years for more investment from the government in public service interest media. We were the Coalition for Better Broadcasting, and the name change reflects the fact that the media ecology has evolved, that it's not only about broadcasting. But I think we'd argue that we're still very much focused on broadcasting as a central component of the media ecology. The demise of television and radio has somewhat been overstated by the digital profits and the woes that claim that everything is going to be superseded by on-demand, online, multiple platform devices. And although that's happening, there's still a long way to go before the old TV in the corner of the living room disappears completely. So I think BPM's view on where things are at the moment is that in some ways history is rather repeating itself. If you go back to 1999, we had a Labour government coming in with a vision of public media after 3 terms of a national government that hadn't been very sympathetic. And of course they start to implement plans and immediately have challenges over the budget. So there's perhaps a little bit of history repeating itself insofar as Labour did promise 38 million, only had 15 in the first round. We're of course hoping for more in the future. But there's a big question about whether the points of intervention and the direction of public policy in the current environment are quite so simple as they were back in 1999. In the multimedia environment, with convergence, increased financialisation, and a massive intensification of competition, means that the market is a very, very different sort of animal in the 21st century. And so that maybe requires new models of public service media. So what kind of models they are and whether they include public television is what we have our panel of experts here to debate today. So the first of our speakers is Stephen Smith. He's the RNZ Head of Audience Strategy. He's responsible for leading RNZ's thinking and activities around audience research, branding, marketing, product development. He's held a number of roles in the New Zealand media industry. He was Head of Multi-Platform at Maori Television. He was the Group Head of Digital at Fairfax, Head of Media and Entertainment at Vodafone New Zealand, and Assistant Chief Executive and Head of Content at TVNZ. So please give Stephen a very warm welcome.
Welcome to Sunday afternoon. To state the obvious, the media sector is going through a period of great upheaval, which is creating significant problems for governments throughout the world as they wrestle with how best to maintain a media ecosystem that keeps people reliably informed, supports democratic engagement, counters misinformation and fake news, and reflects and celebrates the local culture and diversity. While many of the associated problems are beyond the ability of democratic governments to completely control, one of the proven solutions is to ensure that there is at least one well-resourced, non-commercial and independent public broadcaster. The need for this has never been greater than now. In New Zealand, RNZ is the organisation with the core experience and expertise and a strong public media ethos to fulfil this role. Growing the resources available to RNZ will be critical if RNZ is to improve and sustain a commercial-free role in connecting and informing New Zealanders, providing trusted and accurate news and information and exploring and showcasing New Zealand's diverse culture. However, the reaction to investment in RNZ has been that some in commercial media have questioned and lobbied against the value of investing in public media generally and RNZ specifically. And others in publicly owned commercial media have suggested that an answer to their audience and profit decline is that the government should combine its public and commercial media. Of course, we all have financial challenges, but it's not public broadcasting that is hurting commercial media in New Zealand. In fact, in radio, which is arguably the most profitable commercial medium, RNZ has a very strong and symbiotic presence. Making the public broadcaster smaller or weaker won't stop the Googles, the Facebooks of the world, and it won't make New Zealand media companies more profitable. It certainly won't mean better services for New Zealanders, and it won't build the level of trust in and amongst our citizens that all democracies need to thrive. In a recent international report on the sector, PricewaterhouseCoopers finds that the major media brands of the future are those that will have the ability to build and sustain consumer trust, which is why the discussion about public media provided on TV, or for that matter radio or the internet or any other platform, misses the point that to create and sustain trust, what we need to put first and foremost is the public, not the platform. Yes, we will do more and better video content, as we will do more and better audio and written and new media content forms. But the distribution and the channels need to follow, not lead, where the people want and need us to be.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Steve. Okay, well, on to Anna from New Zealand Air. She's a specialist advisor for screen funding in television and digital, is that correct? And is the Hey Hey content funding lead. If you're not familiar with Hey Hey, I'm sure Anna will explain, but it's a very, very interesting children's initiative. She also assists with policy and strategy reviews and produces New Zealand Air's annual diversity report. And although she focuses primarily on screen, she also assists across music and community broadcasting sectors. She's also, happy to say, a former tutor and research assistant at Victoria University, where of course I work, and she actually has her MA with distinction in media studies from Victoria. So big welcome to Anna.
Ngā mihi nui, ngā mihi mahana, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Pākehā oku iwi, ko Scotland oku tupuna, ko Currie oku hapu, ko SS Kaikoura te waka, ko Anna Currie toku o mai. He kai whakahaere a putia o e mahi ana i te irarangi te motu. Kia ora everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Anna Currie and I'm one of the funding advisors at NZ. As the focus of this meeting is on whether or not there is a future for public television, I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about New Zealand Air's recent changes as a public media funding agency, discuss a recent successful collaboration that's involved us, as well as more collaborations to come. Then I'll end by providing a brief overview of audience research we've published this year that reveals interesting trends about how audiences are consuming content in New Zealand, because I believe this is research we should all be paying attention to and trends we should all be paying attention to when we discuss the future of public media. So as many of you will know, in July of last year, NZ On Air launched the NZ Media Fund, which is one single streamlined strategy that replaces our growing number of separate funding strands and strategies that were platform specific. The launch of the NZ Media Fund was a response to changing audience behaviour and an acknowledgement that audiences are fragmenting and consuming content on a multitude of platforms. Before the launch of the NZ Media Fund, our 20-strong agency was quite siloed. We had different teams looking after television, digital and radio, which made sense in an analogue world, but as those terms, television, digital and radio, are becoming harder to define, it was making it very difficult to keep those separate. So the NZ Media Fund is a simplified funding strategy that has 4 funding streams: scripted, factual, music and platforms. And factual and scripted streams, in those we will consider anything for television, online or radio, or a combination of those, which we do really encourage. NZ On Air now takes a platform neutral approach and encourages multi-platform collaboration where possible, because it means that content can reach a larger audience wherever they are consuming content. I would like to talk about Hey Hey for a minute. So this is TVNZ and NZ On Air's joint venture, ad-free online platform for New Zealand tamariki that champions local content. Hei Hei was born out of an understanding of changing audience behaviour, just like the NZ Media Fund was. So as an agency, we were increasingly discomforted at spending a significant amount of money on ephemeral content, so children's content that was being broadcast maybe once on linear television and very likely not being seen again. So we knew we needed to be funding multi-purpose content. Audience research supported this view. We're continually commissioning research and undertaking projects ourselves to ensure that our funding strategies reflect audience behaviour. So in the 2015 Children's Media Use Study, it revealed something quite interesting, and bear in mind this research is over 3 years old now, but it showed that YouTube had overtaken TV2 as the most popular media source for New Zealand children aged 6 to 14. Each day YouTube reached 35% of New Zealand children back in 2015, and TV2 was reaching 32%. It is important to mention that TV was still a consistent presence, reaching 9 out of 10 6 to 14-year-olds each day, but tablets and smartphones had very quickly become part of many children's daily lives, and the uptake of these devices changed the media that children were consuming. So we knew it was time for a change. In 2015, we started a review which involved a discussion paper, publishing submissions to those discussion papers, which kickstarted an industry korero. We put out an RFP to see who would maybe want to partner with us with an online platform for kids. And finally, as a result of that whole process and a lot of amazing mahi from a lot of people, in May of this year, Hei Hei launched. And again, that is a joint venture from NZ On Air and TVNZ. It's an ad-free local content platform for New Zealand children with a strong focus on local content that is available on desktop, tablet and phone, and coming very soon to Chromecast. So Hei Hei is a living, breathing, recent example of how NZ On Air adapts its funding in order to remain relevant for local audiences. It's also an excellent example, in my biased opinion, of a successful industry collaboration that delivers public media content to young New Zealanders who are at a crucial age of developing their sense of self and their cultural identity, for whom local content is vitally important. Now I'll talk about NZ On Air's recent audience research, because I believe that the results of our 2018 Where Are the Audience research provides important context when questioning whether there's a future for public television. So the full report is available on NZ On Air's website, so if you're interested in the detail, please go and find that. But I will try to go over the key findings without bombarding you with too many percentages and other statistics. So this was the third Where Are the Audiences research study that we have published, which Glasshouse Consulting has produced for us. So they've produced that every 2 years since 2014. So we now have 3 reports spread 2 years apart that span 4 years of rapid media change. This year's report shows that traditional media, so by that I mean linear television and live radio, continue to reach the biggest audiences. Linear television reaches 82% of New Zealanders each week, while broadcast radio 78%. But on a daily basis, the audiences of total linear television and broadcast radio continue to decline over time. The ongoing decline of the daily reach of linear TV is interestingly driven by a decline in Sky TV viewing and of viewing linear TV on a pay TV platform. Sky Movies channels show the biggest decline since 2016, which may not be a surprise, whereas Sky Sport channels are more stable. It is important to reiterate that that decline in total linear television is driven by pay TV, because linear TV on a free-to-air platform actually showed a 9% increase in this year's report. The weekly reach of SVOD, subscription video on demand, Netflix, Lightbox, has nearly doubled since 2016. It now reaches more than 6 in 10 people weekly. New Zealand Netflix now reaches 27% of New Zealanders each day. That's up from 14% in 2016. So what does all this mean? Traditional media forms still reach the largest audiences, but there continues to be an increased use of online media forms. The reach of linear TV and live radio audiences continues a pattern of decline, but the rate of change has slowed since 2016, and the weekly reach of linear TV on a free-to-air platform has actually increased this year. So there is a slowing growth of online media, and it's important to note that there have been fewer developments in the last 2 years that would help maintain the previous rate of change. So in the period of the last report, 2014-16, We had the launch of Netflix, Lightbox, Neon in New Zealand, NZME's Watch Me, Apple Music. There just haven't been that many developments in this 2016-18 period for the latest report. Just quickly, another important audience metric to consider is time spent viewing. Time spent viewing means exactly what it says, that the amount of time a user spends, it's an amount of time the user spends viewing that media. So our 2018 research shows that New Zealanders continue to dedicate the most time each day to traditional broadcast media by a considerable margin, and this has declined very little over time. While time spent viewing online media continues to grow rapidly, it's got a long way to go before it reaches the time that we're spending on traditional TV. So New Zealanders each day spend 2.5 hours watching linear television, 1.5 hours listening to radio, compared to 62 minutes on SVOD, subscription video on demand. That's the online media to which users dedicate the most time. So the ongoing pattern of declining reach but stable time spent viewing of linear television and live radio suggests that it's the lighter viewers and listeners who continue to drop out of daily audiences of traditional media, but that they're maintaining a really loyal audience base as well. And finally, in terms of this audience research, it feels important to acknowledge that there is a notable generational divide within these results. The generation gap remains strong and behaviour differs strongly between those over and under about 45 years old. So above this age, traditional media dominates, and below, online media is more popular, which is not a surprise. But this year's report shows that that generational gap is closing, and we can kind of look at as to why. So the closing of the generational gap is due to older New Zealanders adopting online technology. There is now a bigger generational gap between in consuming linear TV, magazines and newspapers as more younger New Zealanders stop using those media each day. But older New Zealanders, those aged 45 and more, have increased their use of daily online video, music streaming, SVOD, on-demand, online radio. So in other words, the profile of online media users has broadened since 2016, while traditional media audiences continue to get older. Other factors do play a role in media consumption, such as access to technology, ethnicity, region, socioeconomic level, but our research showed that none of these factors played as much of a role as age did. Okay, so what does all this mean for NZ On Air and our funding strategy? It confirms that launching the NZ Media Fund was the correct approach. While there is a temptation to have 40 different buckets of funding for all these niche needs, it doesn't make sense. In a complicated, fast-changing media environment, you need a simple and flexible approach. NZ On Air has a strong strategy in how we invest in public media content, but it is a strategy that is flexible enough to adapt to industry changes as they come. Yānaki nui tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you very much, Anna. Okay, so next up we have Mark Jennings. Mark's had a very long and distinguished career in journalism, primarily in broadcasting. He had 10 years in television journalism in Australia, and then in 1989 he came to New Zealand, and he was with MediaWorks for 27 years, which is quite a stint. During that time, he mentored successive generations of acclaimed and well-known journalists, and he was responsible also for launching News Hub across television, across TV3 and Radio Live. So Mark's work is now at Newsroom, focuses on the media industry, business and the tertiary sector, and he's the Newsroom co-editor. So please give Mark a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Peter. And just like to acknowledge some of the other very good journalists sitting in the room, Robert, Barry, George, who some of you won't know, but very well known to me over my career. I guess I'm different from people here. I'm not actively involved in the public sector in any way, but and my remarks, I guess, are mainly observations as opposed to knowing what's really happening. But I've recently interviewed both the two CEOs of our major public broadcasters, Kevin Kenrick and Paul Thompson, and I think it's really interesting to talk to those two because I think we've got something different happening in New Zealand now, and these two have a much bigger focus on the whole media, and I kind of probably like to widen this out a little bit and talk about the whole media. I think Thompson, through his background at Fairfax, And he recently came back, where he obviously faced all the commercial pressures that organisation is under. And he recently came back from Seoul at a public broadcasters conference, which Stephen will obviously be aware of. But during my interview with him, he said something which I now reflect back on, which I think was more interesting than the stuff I kind of reported. But he said that he would not expose RNZ to the risks of linear TV. And I think that's a very telling statement, because I slightly disagree with Anna, although I don't want to disagree with her too much in case we want some funding. But I don't totally believe that survey. I think linear TV is declining quite quickly, and I think we'll get to a point where we'll go over a cliff and decline very quickly. And I think Thompson knows that, and I think because he talked to the BBC, the CBC and the ABC, obviously when he was over there, who are all getting knocked around at the moment on television. RNZ, of course, is different. It doesn't, up until very recently, have any television arm. And my personal view is, I agree with Thompson, he'd be well advised to stay away from it. It's a very tough and precarious business, I think, at the moment. Kenrick, of course, is he's running the only profitable TV network in the country, but I think and we'll just expand on that for a second. MediaWorks hasn't made any money out of TV for a long, long time. My understanding is that they're having quite a good year this year, and they're probably going to get close to break even. But I don't think they're ever going to do better than that, and I think they'll probably end up doing worse than that. Prime, as we know, loses money, but it's supported by Sky. MediaWorks TV, of course, is supported by its radio arm. If it didn't have radio, they would have been out of business absolutely a long time ago. Choice, small player, I don't know much about it. Irene might know a little bit more than me about it, but probably being supported by, I think it's Canadian owners. The news divisions, and I think this is where it gets really interesting. I think probably both of the big news divisions, TVNZ News and 3 News, News Hub, well, News Hub will certainly be not profitable. That news division will be losing money. Obviously, I have some inside knowledge because I ran it for a long time, and given its audience levels where it is now, it has to be basically losing money. I think TVNZ's news will also probably be close to losing money because the 6 p.m. audiences have declined. And of course, 6 p.m. is and has been the powerhouse of television news. But these programs are now in trouble. TVNZ's not quite as much because it's benefited from a very strong lead-in program, and it could still possibly be profitable. But I think Kevin Kendrick is thinking forward. And when we had this discussion the other day about a possible merger or combining, I actually think he's not so much thinking of the whole necessarily, but I suspect he's thinking a bit about the news area, where at some point he's going to have to do something about the costs of news. If MediaWorks is sold, as it is likely to be, or I mean its owners desperately want it to be sold, if it is, then there could be a real problem for news, MediaWorks News, because a new owner will only be buying it for its radio assets. It won't be buying it for the TV assets. So all the news division sits within television and relies on the 6 p.m. bulletin pretty much for revenue. So I think the new owner may well say, right, we're closing television or we're getting out of news. And that's going to be really interesting because radio, commercial radio, if you look at MediaWorks, is mainly music radio. They're only going to want a headline news service. I don't think Radio Live will probably survive much longer. It's just been a money drain, really. It has made no progress against ZB or Radio New Zealand, and actually it won't. So a new owner would probably close that immediately. So the need for a news service out of radio, they could go and buy it off NZME or Radio New Zealand or whatever. So I think we could see MediaWorks News just disappeared, which would be quite a dramatic development in this country. And I think Thompson and I think Kenrick both know these things. So they, I think, want to start a wider conversation in this country about the whole media and its health. Thompson has been very interesting in his sharing of content throughout other media. I think it started off as a brand extension for Radio New Zealand and a smart move. Now I think he probably thinks it's actually an important part of the ecosystem and a way he can help both the commercial sector and other parts of, and TVNZ as well. But there's a bit of a problem with that, in my view, is we again stopping the diversity. While I think it's good, and I think that the standard of news coming out of RNZ is high quality, it is just compressing the number of opinions and sources, if you like, in this country. But it's still a good thing. I think, you know, one of the things that TVNZ, which was, when I look back on it, was a real pity, is that the ZB news arm did not go to TVNZ, that it's gone to NZB. Because I think if TVNZ had a radio arm, then it would be able to look forward and say, we're going to be in the news business here for a significant period of time. Because as I think he was mentioning the PwC report, radio, it looks out 5 years, and radio is the only form of traditional media that actually grows in that 5 years. TV declines from 18.5% of the market to 13.5%. That is a dramatic decline, and it's why I think TV is in a lot more trouble than perhaps people think it is. But radio is actually increasing its share slightly in this period, which is no mean feat. So if TVNZ actually had the ZB radio arm, I think it would be in quite good shape. Anyway, this is sort of a bit of a rambling spiel of mine, but the next thing, of course, is where does the government sit in this? Where does Chris Farfoy sit in this? And perhaps Michael will tell us later on, but I think he's got some major issues to think about. He's got Radio New Zealand, which has performed, in my view, well. It's survived 9 years of national and really did remarkably well in that period of time. Now the purse strings have been loosened up a bit and it's going to get some more money, well overdue, and I think it will make really good use of that money because it's a very lean, focused organisation now. So that will be, in my view, high quality spending that the government puts into that. Farfoy's going to have to think about what happens with TVNZ. At the moment, it's okay, but I think in the next 5 years we'll see that decline. That company declined quite significantly. Then he's got to worry about all the other media. Now, obviously, there is, in my view, a solution here, and again, I'll be very interested to hear Michael's view on this. But if the government does not move to tax Facebook and Google, we've got a big, big problem. I mean, finally, some of the European countries are actually waking up and put a 2% revenue tax on it. The politicians in this country are just too gutless. They're just too wimpy all round. This issue needs to be tackled, should be tackled, and we should take this money and put it into the media here. Otherwise, we're not going to have a media. Well, yes, we'll have Radio New Zealand, but we might not have too much else if we don't do something about it. What would you do if you got the money then? This is the interesting question where Anna comes in and Michael come in. Does it go into NZ On Air and get distributed? I think there's some issues around that, and that is that I think NZ On Air is very good at project-based funding. It will fund, say, investigative journalism, it'll fund some multimedia journalism, it'll fund some other series, and they will be good. But that doesn't address the really core problem we've got here of general news coverage. There's no funding for baseline coverage of news, and that's what is basically disappearing in this country. It's the reason why Newsroom, why we went into business, because we could see all these areas that get no coverage. Our journalists turn up on stories all the time. There's no other journalists here. They're gone. These days, there are so many stories out there, and you've got them on your own. There's no one else covering half of this, because the number of journalists in this country has declined by 60% in the last 10 years. So, there's a big issue. What I'd like to see the government do is tackle Facebook and Google, and then look at a way to increase the baseline economic health of the media. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed to Mark. So, following on, we're going to turn to Professor Wayne Hope from AUT. Wayne's a very well-known media researcher with specialisms in New Zealand political and media history. He's also the author of a major book called Time, Communication and Global Capitalism, which I recommend if you have a rainy day. Wayne's the curriculum leader for undergraduate media communication courses at AUT, and he's the joint editor of an online journal that's run through the International Association of Media and Communication Researchers. You may well have come across him because he's a regular media commentator who's appeared or spoken on a number of broadcast programmes such as TVNZ Breakfast, Face TV, Radio Live, Radio National, 9 to Noon and so on. And he contributes regular commentary pieces for the Daily Blog. So a big welcome to Wayne.
Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. Much of what I wanted to say, or some of what I wanted to say, has been well covered by the other speakers, especially the last point about Google and Facebook. I'm going to start with an advertisement. Apart from what Peter said, I'm also co-director of a media research organisation called Journalism, Media and Democracy. Every year we put out a media ownership report for New Zealand, and that includes sections on public media. We've been doing that since 2011, and they're all online. And this year's report is going to be released on December the 6th. If you want any more details, see me, I'll send you an email. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is because some of my comments today are going to be to do with some latest developments with regard to public radio, with regard to TVNZ, just to see how the numbers look and so on. If we look at things as a trend in New Zealand, since we started doing these reports about 2011, what's been happening is a growing concentration of ownership in commercial media, and within those structures of concentration, a growing dependence on banks and private equity companies to actually run the media. And what that means is that these kinds of owners don't have an inherent interest in developing news, current affairs and the culture of journalism and advancing the public sphere. So therefore, public media has always been up against the 8 ball because of that overall secular ownership trend. If we look at the television market and bring ourselves into this year and maybe the year before, this is what I see happening, and I'll talk about TVNZ a little bit after that. First of all, the impact of social media is really important, not just because it's taking eyeballs away from 6 o'clock, but also because people are starting to use Facebook as their primary news source. And that was a major contributing factor to what happened in the US 2016 election. Facebook news feeds don't have, how can I put it, they don't have a reliable track record, and they come in so fast it's hard to verify what the headlines are actually saying, and that kind of pollutes the public sphere in a way, compared to project funding from New Zealand on Air to help journalists and journalist culture and so on. That's world apart from a growing dependence on Facebook as a news source. We've also seen, of course, the rise and spread of video streaming networks, of which Netflix is the most significant. What we've also seen over the last few years, but it's particularly significant this year, is the decline in paid television, or to put it another way, the decline in Sky. Now, Murdoch used to have a significant share of Sky until about 3 years ago, and then he pulled out because he knew the business model was going to falter. The News Corp guys are pretty shrewd in their projections. So Sky became owned by financial enterprises, by banks and so on, and it's struggling. Two big things happened this year. It hasn't lost, but it's been sort of sidelined by the deal between TVNZ and Spark and the Rugby World Cup coverage. And in the projection ahead for the America's Cup, that's a TVNZ Spark arrangement by the looks of it at this stage. So Sky's struggling a little bit. So what about TVNZ itself? Well, this year's total revenue is 319 million, approximately the same as the previous year, so that's fairly solid. The two news sites that they have, TVNZ, Co-NZ and One News Now, made an almost 60% increase in revenue compared to the year before. And as I said, TVNZ is actually investing long-term in these sport arrangements with Spark. So it actually, there's a bit of revenue there. And it's just a matter of using some of that to reinvest into a public media or a public television initiative. So the question is, what should that be? And so I'm just going to take a stab. I think that we ought to revisit the TVN6, TVN7 channels that we had under the previous Labor government. Maybe not two, just the one. But this time, that particular channel would also have locked into it some video streaming coming through it and also an internet presence. So in other words, it's TVNZ7 Plus. Because one of the key things about television media now, it's not either or. It's not like television's going down the plug hole and we're going to get lots of new media. What it is a remediation. And TVNZ, I think, in a commercial sense, has done quite a good job of actually dealing with this. As I said, their revenue is high this year as it was last year. I think we might need to have another look at dividends going to Treasury and how much that should be. There should be some logic of reinvestment. I think the big problem the last government made, before the key government, is that they didn't have any legal protection or legislative underpinning for the TVN6 and TVN7 initiatives. So any kind of initiative along those lines, with an internet presence and a video streaming presence, needs to be legally anchored. Otherwise, when there's a next change of government, it'll just be pushed out again and you get this endless pendulum that we have in New Zealand politics. I think we could do a little bit more with the parliamentary channel and extend that a little bit, extend its hours. Depends what kind of remit you want. Depends whether you want to make it mainly news and current affairs or if you want to do other stuff. But there's definitely opportunities there, and there always has been. So I'll just leave that in the air for TVNZ. If we go to radio, it's pretty clear from this year's figures that actually Radio New Zealand is performing pretty well. But before I get to that, I think we need some joined-up thinking in the radio sector from a public media perspective. I don't think using RNZ as a vehicle for a television channel initiative was really ever going to work. There were insufficient funds to start with, and it's always been pushed further and further out into the future. And with the turmoil over the broadcasting ministership per se, the chances of it coming in this term of government are very low indeed. And I think we should have a different set of priorities. And with priorities I'm talking about are joined up thinking. So, in other words, what I'd like to see is Radio New Zealand develop as it is, but I'd like to see more linkages between Radio New Zealand and the access radio stations. A colleague of mine in the Communication Studies Department, Dr. Matt Mulgard, has just completed a major 25,000-word study for New Zealand On Air, doing basically an overview of all the access stations, how much funding they get, what audiences they get, what remits they have and how they're doing. And Matt was saying that there's really clear opportunities here for a complementarity between access radio on the one hand and TVNZ and Radio New Zealand on the other. Radio New Zealand seems to be a little bit more top-down, whereas access is more local. So you've got this sense of localism. And it's this sense of localism which we're losing in our overall media ecology. There's no question about that. And I think this is the way where we could actually push the envelope back a little bit. I think there also needs to be some complementarity with the iwi radio network. So what I mean by these complementarities is integrated funding, perhaps sharing operational facilities. My understanding is that that would certainly be possible with Radio New Zealand and some of the access radio facilities. But also philosophically, We need to put forward principles of a public sphere which handles things at the state level but also handles things at the local level. And we need a set of philosophies or principles which would hold this joined up thinking about radio together. And I think that's where we should be going. So I'll just leave it there because I really agreed with a lot of what the other speakers were saying as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roy. So our penultimate speaker is Allan Martin, OBE. Allan, of course, has recently joined us on the BPM board. He's a hugely experienced broadcaster. He worked as a TV executive on both sides of the Tasman, but he has his roots in program making. He began making TV in England in the early 1960s, and coming back to New Zealand, he developed influential programs for the NZBC in Compass and Town and Around. Then went to the ABC in Australia and returned to New Zealand in the mid-1970s to set up the new second channel, and he later became Director General of TVNZ. So bringing wealth of experience, please welcome Allan Martin.
Well, an antiquated and perhaps simplistic view of the situation. But as we all know, there is an argument which suggests that the spread of media outlets via the internet will meet the objectives of public service television. That this diversity will fulfil the aims of public service media, but it won't. Fragmentation of the means of communication is more likely to result in smaller groups being supplied with information they already endorse. Only a national service which has the capacity to maintain a range of programs and ideas to attract people to watch, read or listen to that particular service will be able to achieve the aims of public service media. Maintaining a variety of high standard programming is a requirement for a public service channel to be meaningful. Something an independent media group would be not willing to undertake in the long term without commercial support. Consistency in output, whether international or local, can only be achieved by an organisation with the facilities and preferably much of the staff operating on a full-time basis. If you want to give society full expression to the state of affairs within it and the conditions and existing at that time and the possibilities of change, possibilities of the alternatives, you must have an authoritative and commercial-free voice. Preferably maintaining a quality of output at a price which can be justified to the public. But you cannot suddenly arrive at a fully developed public TV service. It takes time to recruit, to train if necessary, a like-minded core of professional people working within a culture with similar ideals. You need people who have ideas, people who care, who have a passion for what they are doing, and who understand what can be achieved within society, the conditions prevailing in society at the time, and their responsibilities as a broadcaster. And people of that, I'm delighted to see today two of those people who in the past have achieved that situation, namely Bob Ellis and maybe more, and George Andrews here in Documents. Now George is a lovely example, a prime example of the situation I'm talking about, in that working in a public interest television at the time, 40 years ago, he had the idea that the public needed to know that the price of progress came at a cost to the landscape. And he worked on this idea, and he produced a series of programs called Landmark, as I remember, with Professor Cumberland, and it was very successful. It was, in fact, I think, the genesis of the understanding we have today of the need to protect the landscape. And it probably was the forerunner of many of those controls and restrictions that we have on the landscape today. And the number of protest groups that we arise very quickly to protest the landscape. So thank you, George.
Thank you, Allan. You've got it going.
So I'm diverting that. But anyway, to resolve the present situation, well, the Broadcasting Act has been changed many times, over 20. I think it's about 25 to date. That's the Act itself, with over 100 amendments, and sometimes quite rapidly and without difficulty. So it should be relatively quick and easy decision, in my view, to make one of the TVNZ channels a standalone commercial company with the profits not going back into the public service, the general fund, but to support the other public service channel and public service radio. Piecemeal funding through a filtering organisation like New Zealand On Air will not work. So if it's generally accepted that broadcasting should be a matter of information, enlightenment, education, if you will, and entertainment, then we will know. In the long term, a commercial-free public service channel would need to be given time to develop, ideally seeking economies of scale, and initially with limited local content. And it would be essential to maintain that local contact very, very successfully. The first programs would need to be successful because of the media focus, because of government expectations, and the need to engender public support from the beginning. That is, to grow from small triumphs and ensure public support and public awareness of the benefits. But it could start with some advantages, such as Country Calendar and Fair Go and other examples which have endured. However, these ideals would require the backing of an enlightened public administration, which accepted the need to provide society with a public service system. But governments are rarely that proactive, and it will take much pressure on them and for them to legislate a commercial-free environment where the pursuit of fact, beyond the 5-second news soundbite, would, and the exploration of ideas, I might say, would undoubtedly benefit the individual, the community, and our society. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to Allan. Now our final speaker is actually a special guest. Very privileged to have two members of the government's Ministerial Advisory Group with us. We have both Irene Gardner and the chair of that group, Michael Stiassny. So Michael, would you care to say a few words? Would you like to come to the front?
So I'll give you a few personal comments because it's inappropriate to give you anything else. I guess we came to observe, so on a Sunday afternoon, so this is slightly different. The first thing is we're all a little bit unsure about what the new minister is up to. I think we all thought that we would be replaced or terminated or whatever. We're still in existence and we do have some new terms of reference as of last week. So our role specifically now is to assist and recommend, I think, on the budgets of RNZ and NZ On Air. I think previously under Minister Currie it was more to resolve, so we're giving advice. So that's quite good. My discussions with the Minister, I think we should all feel happy or slightly more relaxed that he does, from his own personal experience, he does understand the situation, and I think he has a sympathy for the issues. Whether that manifests itself in a good outcome is about Parliament and Cabinet engagement rather than anything else. But he is, I think, supportive. So I think there are two big issues that Mark probably discussed more than anyone else. The first one is that we have an issue in a distinction between commercial and non-commercial. We have Fairfax, NZME, and we have MediaWorks and Sky, all with their own issues. And they've all been trying to play around with solutions. They haven't paid me to advise them on their solutions, but none of them have worked to date. And as they wouldn't have got my support, I feel quite good about it. But it's quite clear that they're struggling to find solutions to survive successfully in this environment. So that's over there. Sorry, I ramble around a bit. We have a regulatory framework over here called the Commerce Commission, which has stepped into Fairfax and NZME and would probably step into any other engagement and would stop it. Now, in a short-term environment, stopping the NZME Fairfax merger would appear to be a very good idea. But if we look out to 5, 10, 15 years, the issues that we should all be thinking about is that there isn't enough money in a population of 4 million people to run media to a level that we all want. And that's the fundamental issue. It's only going to get worse. I mean, let's be honest, Netflix makes a TV program significantly, no, it doesn't make it cheaper, but it can sell it to a wider audience than we can, so therefore it can pump product down the tube a lot easier than we can in New Zealand outwards. So we have a problem, and whether that's news or whether it's programming, it is going to become more and more common that our children will be listening to American accents or whatever far more frequently than they are already, and they are already anyway. So it's a big issue. So from where I sit on a personal level, Fairfax, NZME, for instance, a merger to hold them together for a short period of time while they're dying is a lot better than having them die. And you hope that something will eventuate to keep them alive, albeit that is remote, I think. So that's your landscape. If that's your landscape, there can be no doubt that keeping public media funded is really, really critical for survival. The biggest issue is that when you're sitting in Cabinet, they have not only public media to deal with, they have 101 other things to deal with. And we know that there is not enough money in the system to fund everything. So you have to accept that, we're a pimple on the bum, so to speak. We might be more important than some other things, but you have to sell that message to Cabinet, to government, and to the public. And to date, I don't think you have. So the number one issue, does the man, the man or woman on the Clapham omnibus understand the seriousness of the debate we should be having? And I don't think they do. And until they do, there's not enough noise about this issue. There are you and a few other people, not a lot else. So I think we should all acknowledge Claire Curran's contribution. She actually had the right idea. A whole lot of other issues got in the way, but public media is so critical to New Zealand's fabric and society that something needs to be done. But the big issue is that there isn't an awareness of the real issue outside of the public. So number one, I think that's what you should be doing. Number two, because there isn't enough money and there is not enough to share around, we come to the real big conflict, the conflict between plurality and survival. Where I sit is we won't achieve both. So to me, what is happening now with Kevin Kendrick what we tried to achieve with the new funding between New Zealand On Air and Radio New Zealand is about sharing the resource, both asset-wise and people-wise, inside public media to squeeze the best outcomes we can with as little as we have. And so the work that's being done by two gentlemen whose names escape me. Is about how much is available from an asset base around collaboration. I think, unfortunately, we're going to be surprised there isn't that much around, but sharing of assets creates a culture of sharing ideas and working together to get the best outcome. So hopefully it will lead into the second. And that's, unfortunately, the best we can do. There's a whole other discussion about Maori TV and the necessity of how we're going to get an increase in of the funding, but the outcomes around Te Reo. Pacific languages are in a worse state than Te Reo. We haven't even got to that because whilst we're a diverse population, we seem to be a Maori and European debate, but it should actually be about a much wider group of language survivors. So, how's that for a comment?
Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed to all our speakers. So we'll open the floor up to questions. Miles, did you want to interject with any actions?
If things go well, I'll start reading some of these questions over here.
Rightio, but if anyone has a question, fire away. David at the front, and we'll move around.
Sure. Cool. I do have a question here. I'm going to get to it, and I could put it up front as well, but I also want to speak for a minute or so with it, if that's okay. So the question, I'll put it up front, is whether to tinker or whether to go with some radical change. Paul went back to 1999, and it was nice to hear going back to back 40 years. The landscape we currently have in New Zealand for broadcasting is the one that was put in place 30 years ago, when we established a system which was for television, across the board commercial, with a separate, editorially independent funding agency. And from my point of view, over the past 30 years, the best thing we've had going for public media has been New Zealand On Air. So whatever we do, I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater. But I also personally don't think we should just tinker. Just a personal reflection, overnight, I don't know if anyone in this room knew him, a producer called Phil Shingler died overnight. Phil, with Alistair Barry, who's a New Zealand filmmaker, made what was potentially, I think it was a pioneering and possibly the first, I don't know, New Zealand UK co-production, which was Nuclear Free Pacific. It was made in 1988, just before the changes. Well, Phil is no longer with us. Alistair's been making really important documentaries, but on the bones of his bum, and not supported by the commercial media structures. And Ruth Harley, who was the other key person in that, because she was the TVNZ, I think, commissioner who made it happen. Ruth Harley went up and set up New Zealand On Air, and is now its chair. She was the initial director, and she's now its chair. Now, some major change took place. I think a major change that went with that was the conceptual one of thinking of viewers as consumers rather than citizens. I think we should arguably revisit that. And I'm interested in what was being talked about in terms of a relationship potentially with access media, because there is something in that, because participatory trends are the opportunity, and I've been banging this drum for some time, for public media. where content is coming from the citizenry as much as for the citizenry. I think the big question, yes, levies. I think we do need to grapple with that. So, a lot of what's been said. I think you've got 4 options. You've got the TVNZ 767 option, which was great, but it was tinkering. You've got the potential of RNZ to become more pluralistic with its voices, with more participation, and with sufficient investment to also be able to do the blue chip stuff, the documentaries that cost $500,000 and really go somewhere as single one-off documentaries. That doesn't happen just by financial tinkering, which is what's been taking place. I'm almost finished. Or you've got, do we try and do something with TV1, which has been our most traditionally identified public broadcaster, and I know there's at least one view in this room that thinks that's where we should go. Or option 4, do we do something else altogether? Now, I think those are the 4 options, but what they all need to do, I believe, is not just tinker, that we need to go back to 1988-89 and go, look what happened then. Now we don't want to go back there. The world has been pointed out as changed. We need to go forward. But do we just tinker, or do we get radical? They got radical then.
Thank you, David.
Don't you have to establish how you're going to, even if everyone agrees to do what you suggest, isn't it almost impossible to achieve in this current environment? That's the one thing we've learned.
Why is that? How do you figure that?
Because to get radical change, which is what you prefer, you need to have an environment that is accepting of radical change. Currently, I think we'd say, that from what we've seen, that is not the platform you had. Might be the right answer.
We didn't in 1988 or 9.
Fine, so then your discussion is about how do you create the environment to achieve dramatic change.
In terms of funding, there's absolutely no doubt, from a practical point of view, that you could tax Google and Facebook. The obstacles are not economic, they're political. But it's important to distinguish those 2 words, because you've got to have a vision for how things could be properly funded with good examples, rather than say, oh no, this is not operable because the economics won't work. That's actually not the case at all. The economics would work. I mean, look at how much tax they don't actually pay. Their business model is premised on having a very tiny number of workers to pay and just cannibalising, commodifying content. So they can be taxed without much danger of them falling over or anything like that. It's just a political obstacle.
No, that's not fair. You're mixing metaphors. The first issue is whether we should tax Google and Facebook, and I actually agree we should, but you have to create an environment. So the first debate is around the fact that big corporates aren't paying enough tax. The second one is you then go and tax them, but then there's an exceptionally large leap from taxing corporates to put the money in the kitty to give it to you only. And that again comes back to the same issue. Why would we give it to this part of society when there's a whole lot of other people who need it more or less? So, a whole lot of steps in what you've suggested.
The argument would be that it's Facebook and Google are undermining the business models of mainstream media.
But the fundamental is that they are not paying their fair share of burden to keep New Zealand society alive.
I think there's 2 separate issues here. They're related, but they're separate. Issue 1 is whether or not Google should pay tax along with McDonald's. Yeah, and if that tax goes into the consolidated fund, well, isn't that just part of business taxation in general? Something Better Public Media Trust did put forward, it wasn't our only idea, but it was an idea whilst National was in power, because they wanted a fiscally neutral option for funding, was a marginal levy on a very, very wide range of media. And what we suggested is if you put maybe 0.5%, a tax across a very, very
wide range of media, including subscription media that would now cover Netflix and Lightbox. If you also included potentially advertising, although that's problematic in the current environment with the tight market, internet service providers, telecommunications tax. I mean, there already is a levy on the Broadband Development Fund, so that already exists actually, and it's due to run out soon. So you could continue that. And the other idea was to put a very small tax on retail products, that all the hardware that consumers use to access all these new media products. So, for example, if you go and buy a $1,000 television, maybe $10 of that or $5 of that goes into the pot. So it's treating the media ecology as a whole and making sure that the businesses that profit the greatest from that media ecology contribute to offsetting the market failures that their commercial activities tend to produce.
In some ways, regional fuel tax.
A bit like a regional fuel tax, if you
But
like.
it's across the board, it's not.
So I think there's two issues there. Sorry, Mark.
There's another point to this. Like Michael's quite right. Why should the media get it as opposed to doctors and nurses or these things? But I think the answer to that is democracy. My own view is that the media is the cornerstone of democracy. It's the thing that keeps everybody honest. It keeps a healthy society. And if we look what's happening in the US, we can see what happens when the society goes unhealthy, I think, because the media has got itself in a quagmire. So I think that's the answer. But I take your point, we need to convince everyone out there.
Okay. Thank you very much. Jeff.
I was going to address this question and point out that the UK government this week, not particularly enlightened government, is about to introduce a 2% tax on Google and the likes. So what I think is quite important to start moving towards getting together shared interests, people with a vested interest, to put pressure on the government, to not be quite so timid, to follow suit with other governments are doing around the world. And it shouldn't be a big task.
Well, I think they are putting it on the agenda. Robertson's said that we'll look at it.
Yeah, but more than look at that, BPM and other interest group to just be, now very much active and pushing this. So,
And that follows on the idea of having a national conversation around these issues, which I think more than one person is called for.
Okay, sorry, there was a question at the back and then George.
Yeah, my question maybe before the speakers have finished, but I just want to pick up a thought that Michael Stiassny made. I think what he's saying is you've got to take the public with you. You can't have some elitist argument, otherwise the government won't feel like they've got any sort of a mandate to do it. So one of the things I would like to explore is going back to the days of the 60s and 70s, the days of the old Lizzie B, but also the BBC, where they had some sort of a requirement to inform, educate and entertain. Those first two words seem to have largely disappeared. It's all about entertaining. Even the news hour, some people seem to think it's a joke, about pulling the butterflies off, the wings off butterflies in interviewing politicians rather than getting to real facts. So I'm not too sure what the current requirement is, but surely all broadcasters being in receipt of a licence to occupy part of the broadcast spectrum, there should be a requirement for them to provide at least a proportion of informative and educational programs, not just go for the lowest common denominator, endless cookery shows, etc., etc. So, although that's not strictly about creating one public interest broadcaster, it's about changing the environment of broadcasting. I think at the moment people see the Gogglebox as just something to kill time and use when they need to chill out.
Well, I think what you were alluding to is the case of the UK, where actually all the other free-to-air commercial broadcasters do have some minimum obligations to provide basic public service requirements, including local news and certain types of programming, which they're desperately trying to get out of for commercial purposes. I don't know, would anyone from the panel care to respond to that? Would that be a viable option for New Zealand?
I think it would be if that's the cost of getting some share of the funding. I think it's reasonable for the government to say, we're going to give you some money, then you need to commit to news, current affairs, information type programming. Yeah, I don't think there's a free lunch, so I agree.
And those are values that are enshrined in RNZ, so it's not a challenge of doing anything in particular. But if I go back to kind of the current economic viability of commercially owned media, if you're going to, if we impose another cost on top of what's frankly a perilous commercial media environment, what does that mean, frankly, to the businesses? I don't think it addresses the underlying issues or problems that are challenging the commercial media. And for public media, it's there now.
Yeah.
Well, I think Finland is the prime example today. The similar situation, a small population, and the same problems that we've got. And they've successfully maintained a public service, single independent public service channel through introducing a marginal tax rate successfully. I think it's a great example for New Zealand to follow myself.
So who's taxed with the marginal tax rate in Finland?
Sorry?
Where does the marginal tax rate apply to what entities?
I can't remember exactly how the tax rate works, but it was acceptable to the public. That was the big thing about it. Everybody accepted it as a good idea. And so it wasn't a problem to get it introduced, to get that tax rate introduced.
I was just going to say, so those REFIN principles, that's sort of what NZ is founded on as well, this kind of the public media. So the idea that this is a contestable fund for non-commercial and commercial media outlets in New Zealand, to access those funds, they need to be displaying a high quality of public media and the content that they want NZ On Air funding for. And the way that allowing that to be funded through NZ On Air means that it's content where different audiences are accessing their content. So for audiences who maybe don't use TVNZ or RNZ, they're still able to, and I'm thinking younger New Zealanders here, they're still able to access that content on, say, the spin-off or Vice, and it's content that's founded on those principles also.
I've just come back from Australia, watching the ABC coverage of the Wentworth by-election. And of course, there's a hostile government to the ABC in power in Canberra at the moment. So what kind of arguments do they advance? Well, of course, they advance those public sphere arguments. But there's another thing as well, and that's localism and infrastructure. I mean social infrastructure. These kinds of public media initiatives around ABC, and that includes radio and television, it's about the core of communities. It's about communities being able to talk to each other. If you took that out, there'd be a huge kind of gap in civic society and in political culture as well. And I think that's, in terms of getting across to middle New Zealand, I think it's that sense of having ownership over a social infrastructure, I think it's probably one of the most powerful arguments you can use.
Okay. Thanks, Ray. So a question from George and then a question at the back.
I do want to start with a question, and I think it is whether we are sufficiently questioning the circumstances we found ourselves in. I don't know whether you noticed in the New Zealand On Air newsletter a couple of months ago, there was an acknowledgement of a man called John Stevenson. And he's interesting in this context, Michael, because he wasn't a broadcaster, he was a regulator. And in the years when we were setting up TV3, there suddenly became a complete change in the funding paradigm. It followed after a comprehensive review of broadcasting structures in New Zealand. Allan will remember that a lot of British broadcasters came out, but the prime objective for broadcasters was to devise a system that would work for New Zealand. Now the surprise we got, and this is when the third channel hearings were happening, out of the blue came this new funding model that there would be, all public money would go to a single funding agency. It was called the New Zealand Broadcasting Commission, and with little consultation, very little discussion, this model was thrust upon us. It's been copied nowhere else on earth. And Mr. Stevenson's passing was noted only by New Zealand On Air. He's not recognised as a key contributor to New Zealand broadcasting, yet he affected, and that Labour government of the time accepted, this complete change, where the public money would be dispensed on a contestable basis with no editorial authority. And one of Allan's good points, you made a lot of good ones there, Allan, was that the broadcasters in most democracies have an editorial control. And the fatal flaw with New Zealand On Air, not much addressed, and it's not must address, because New Zealand On Air for these 30 years have been handing out the money. And the key fundamental concept as to whether they should dispense to a myriad of eyeballs and ears. Money here, money there, money there. And I'll come quickly to the present again. We now have public money divested to this fragmented audience. There is not a single place in New Zealand when you can go and watch or listen, with the exception of Radio New Zealand, when in crisis or important matters you can turn to in confidence that time will be set aside for this, that the archives will be kept, that there will be a variety of New Zealand programs shown in prime time, and that there is a single agency or agencies whose purpose is secure and funded, whose job it is to in whatever medium, be it online or whichever variety of web applications there are, you can turn to with certainty. Where do you go now in New Zealand for a single place to find out what's going on? The eyeballs are the thing. There's this proliferation of outputs. And the idea of a single New Zealand broadcaster, which belongs to us all, and has this job in this tiny, remote, distant country of holding firm on our media and our culture for us, has gone. And this review doesn't consider that whether we do in fact have Mr. Stevenson's model. Is that the best answer? Why has it not been copied for 40 years? If this is the most important thing, David, that we have in New Zealand, why has no one else picked it up?
It's just the best in it.
Well, and I haven't been exploring all the different taxes and ways that we can do this, but I return to Allan's point that a broadcasting system for this people, where people who care about it and whose job is not looking about the bottom line or trying to work some kind of deal, but whose purpose and passion and community is for this purpose. As far as I know, the BBC, old auntie BBC, still manages to deliver a variety of outputs in all media. And they're a much bigger country, and they do web, it's easy to find, they do sound. You can find in one secure place in the United Kingdom a comprehensive and up-to-date, contemporary, forward-looking thing. We somehow, and I pay credit to New Zealand On Air, and they've parlayed their model well. They have great interest in doing so, because it's provided a career and a single consistent voice throughout. But I just invite you, my question is, at this crucial time, can we please include the wisdom and relevance of that model today? And when we have such a scattered sources, competing media, overseas influence, cannot we not please consider, and I don't think this would be such a huge radical step. We have the assets. I'm not trying to advise you on how exactly you do the distribution, but I want to hold fast to that idea of a New Zealand broadcasting service. We're smart. Look what we're able to do. This is something entirely within our capacity and ability to do. So my question is, can we please include at this critical time a consideration of whether we might return to Mr. Stevenson's single idea and revisit it and ask ourselves, is there not a better way of pulling together the resources, of which we don't have enough, to do a bigger job, but which does not depend on this model, which revisits and maybe leaves for others to work out the commercial interest, the investment bankers, the pension funds who run TV3 and MediaWorks. Somehow we are waiting for them to make up their minds, where we have the wits and the means and the skill to take hold of it at this moment still. It's not radical. It's not radical to have a television, radio, broadcasting system funded for us, non-commercial, is it? Is that so very hard? We have the technology, we have the people, and I've given you the question.
Okay. Do any of our panel like to respond? Maybe Anna, since you're representing New Zealand on that.
Yes, yeah, sure. So your point just about that, I'm sure, in terms of NZ On Air not having an editorial arm, was that a criticism?
I noticed you're changing with Radio New Zealand.
Right, so no, NZ On, there's like a deliberate reason why New Zealand On Air doesn't have any sort of editorial control, and it's to create a barrier between the government and platform. So, but in terms of, well, and funder, but we will only commission content or fund content that has a free-to-air platform that is attached to the content creator, and they perform a commissioning role. So they have the editorial. There's a deliberate reason why NZ On Air stays out of that. We're just committed by the Broadcasting Act. We go through that, and that's how we assess applications, whether they adhere to public media principles. And then it's up to the platform and the content creator to make content for that particular platform's audience.
It's not the best way.
And it's slightly more complicated than that. Can I just
add
a little thing? Because, you know, from experience, I know it's more complicated than that. A programme can have a platform commitment to screen it, but that's not sufficient for New Zealand On Air funding. It actually has to have a letter of support asking for New Zealand On Air to fund it. So it
also needs money coming from the platform in almost every case.
Well, it does now, but still that doesn't happen in some content. And third-party funding can come. Yeah. But unless, so the media platforms play a role, not just in being new platforms which filmmakers can, once they've got their platform, access New Zealand On Air's funding. The platforms actually play a determining role on how New Zealand On Air spends its money. They have, so they decide which programs they want New Zealand On Air to support. Having said, they'll show them on their platform. So the example which I experienced is that you can, as an independent filmmaker, you can have a platform saying they'll show your film, but we don't want New Zealand On Air to fund it. So that line is crossed by that, if I can call it, rather bizarre and unfair two tracks, the platform and the letter of commitment.
I think there's a question there about whether or not there's gatekeeping power bestowed upon the platform providers, the distributors,
and it's the way
because unless they agree to show it, of course, you can't get the funding for the content. Now, there's an interesting thing that happened recently, and maybe this will come up in the discussion. I won't talk about it at length, but the new joint investment fund, kind of collaboration between RNZ and New Zealand On Air, where New Zealand On Air provides the funding on a contestable basis to the local production community, but that $6 million fund is earmarked for distribution on RNZ. So that, I don't know if that's an interesting way forward, because what you've effectively done is vertically integrated the funding body with a public broadcaster to make sure that you don't have a commercial gatekeeper going, nah, we don't want that public service stuff.
Well, it works best because in that case the editorial decisions are made by the broadcaster, not and they decide how the money's spent. I don't think you.
We've got several. Sorry, no. I think this gentleman had a response.
Yeah, I was very struck by Mark's reporting of Paul Thompson's comment that he would not expose Radio New Zealand to the risks of linear TV. And Mark talked about Paul Thompson thinking that linear TV was a very rough, precarious business. Now, Claire Curran, for all her faults, had a very clear vision of of RNZ Plus, a standalone public television channel. But it would seem at the moment there's a real backing away from that. And I wondered what the panel thought about whether that notion of RNZ Plus as a standalone public television channel is dead in the water. I can understand RNZ has other priorities at the moment, developing its news service, and its news service, in my view, is better than it's ever been. It's done some remarkably good investigative reporting lately, the reporting of the Southern DHB's failure to do prostate cancer operations. It's reporting on steel and tubes, use of substandard steel. And just last Friday, just before the 8 o'clock news, there was a very good piece of research on the record of Carl Grubchek, the Centre of Immigration Scandal, his criminal record, which I haven't seen anywhere else. It was a very good, concise piece of research done in a very short time. RNZ is, in radio, is doing investigative reporting, which traditionally radio didn't do. But that's an aside. Does the panel think that the notion of RNZ Plus as a standalone public television channel is dead in the water? What does the panel think? If it is that a good thing?
What Paul was talking to was linear television as we all know and understand it today. So in part, RNZ was captured by a debate where people sought to define RNZ's interest in doing more in video and on television as being some kind of competition to the commercial model. So big shiny floors, studios, $50 million building on the corner of Victoria and Hobson Street. That's not what RNZ has said that it would like to be tethered to or tied to. And Mark's talked to the declines in audiences, and I would concur with him around the speed of that decline and the velocity of that decline as opposed to some of the research. But it doesn't mean that RNZ doesn't have ambitions in the context of doing more in the video form. I mean, we are already on television, Channel 50, Checkpoint goes out, we've got an hour and a half of TV a night already on Channel 50, on the Freeview platform, so we're actually already there. But you need to think about it in that context as an expansion.
But why would you want to split your resources? Why would you want, you've got two separate medias, why would you want to split your resources? Why wouldn't you concentrate on making radio the best in the world and not a middle?
Well, I think we do want to make our radio the best in the world.
But you will never do that once you get tied into television.
That's only if we adopt a traditional broadcast approach. Big shiny floors, great big studios. If you watch Checkpoint on television, you'll see that it's a radio studio with cameras in it, right?
Yeah, and you won't stop there.
And last week,
you'll start enlarging and making demands on your staff and the resources to enlarge the television output.
But there isn't a newsroom in the country where journalists aren't expected to file across multiple media forms. That is the sad and actual reality of today.
Yeah. Can we expect to see more programs like Checkpoint? Is that what the $6 million is going to go towards with RNZ?
No. The Innovation Fund is a contestable fund that's jointly managed by New Zealand On Air and RNZ. And what we've identified, and by and large, most of the content associated, overwhelmingly, the majority of the content associated with that also involves the participation of independent producers and or content makers.
Sounds like a very complicated system to me.
Well,
how do people access that?
The access the fund?
No, access the program. How will they work?
Well, the Innovation Fund was announced about 3 months ago. The MOU was signed about a month after that. The first of the request for proposals, which was around a diverse media journalism fund, went out about a month and a half ago. They're being assessed now. There'll be 2 more RFPs that'll go out before Christmas this year. One will be for growth audiences, so that'll target regional, youth, Māori and Pacifica, and a signature series, so something in the mould of Rua Peka Peka, which you might be familiar with, that RNZ did last year. But it's not about turning on a tap. This stuff ain't going to show up.
What I mean, how audiences access the
content. Well, the primary platforms will be RNZ's platforms.
The website?
Right? Yeah, correct. Application, our Channel 50, our radio network. In fact, we've had some fantastic advances around smart speakers. There's a whole raft, podcasting, there's a whole raft of assets, distribution assets that RNZ has. But first and foremost, it's about serving the audience that we've identified that we want to support and serve. Then it's about the content that we would make that meets that brief. And then we talk about distribution. Some of those things over time we'll own, others will share. The conference that Mark referred to, that Paul attended, I mean, the subject of his speech was, radical sharing. So this is not, this is the Innovation Fund, but frankly beyond the Innovation Fund, into our day-to-day news and current affairs reporting. I mean, there's strong evidence of us working with small and large media entities, large commercial, very small private, family-run media organisations around the country. So, you know.
So do you think Innovation Fund content will be shared?
Can I just answer Barry's question? Barry asked a question, is RNZ Plus as a linear channel dead in the water, more or less, or what's the status with it? The view is it was dead before it even began, essentially. The $6 million for a linear TV channel or whatever it was just nuts, and this is why Claire's thinking hasn't been.
She thought she had 38.
Well, kind of well received. So I think what this point Stephen's making is that they've always seen it as a multimedia addition to RNZ, and he's right. Every newsroom has to be in the video game whether they like it or not. And I think RNZ is going to try and do it in the most cost-effective way that it can, Barry. But yeah, it's never going to be a linear channel like TV1 or TV3.
And I'd just like to say that a great thing about the Joint Innovation Fund is that it does champion independent producers, especially for the diverse journalism one we've just seen, and that is an important part of sustaining the industry. We've got to remember that there are independent producers who are creating content for platforms, and that's absolutely what NZ On Air wants to see. And yeah, if it creates more content like Rua Peka Peka, I feel like that was a bit of a flagship for RNZ, and sort of this is what RNZ is capable for in terms of like AV content or video content, and so that's probably the path it's going to take.
So I had a question at the back and then another question over here.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to just pick up on something that Mark said about half an hour ago, using the word democracy. Because a lot of what you're talking about is a broken system and a distribution model that's past its use by date. You can't tax audience behaviour, so you can't tax Google and Facebook and expect the audience is going to come back to you. What you need to do is actually revalue the audience and revalue the system. You've got a title called Better Public Media. All I've heard is commercial, profit-driven media all the way through this conversation. Has anybody actually got any ideas about public media and how to make public media exist in this country? Because it currently doesn't. I mean, have you thought about setting up a public trust for TVNZ so that it's not a commercial model? So that it is actually being revalued as social capital for the country?
Anybody want to respond?
Well, the trouble is that if you wanted to take TV1 non-commercial, you've got to find $250 million straight away. And it goes to Michael's point. Where's that coming from?
Sorry, could you repeat that again? Sorry.
So, if you want to take TV1 non-commercial, it will cost you $250 million.
Why is that?
The cost of, if you take out the lost advertising, that's the first thing. I think that's
180 million.
About 80.
Okay. Well, make TV2. What about making TV2 non-commercial?
TV2 small.
No, not too small to start.
No, he's talking about how to make TV1 non-commercial. Well, it would
start with TV2. Make TV2 non-commercial. Small, as you say, and you've got to start small. There's no way you can start
country. Maybe it needs to be brought in under the arts, culture and heritage remit rather than broadcasting. Because clearly it has an arts and cultural and heritage benefit to this country. So you've got several options available to you. All you're really talking about at the moment is a private profit-driven model.
I guess rather than ask TVNZ to be something that it is completely not, right? The idea of the separation of channels, I've lived through this before, there isn't a TV1 team and a TV2 team. All the back-end services support two. The TV1 and TV2 sit as two consumer-facing channels. The back-end supports both of those channels. It's a commercial organisation. Yes, it's having its troubles, but why not let it continue to be a commercial organisation, whatever shape that might be? Don't ask it. I mean, it's it seems very difficult to me to see how you would achieve that kind of both commercial and cultural shift. You've already got a public media organisation. Why not expand its remit? Why not expand its resources?
Well, that's great if you could do it, yeah.
Why would it be hard to make TVZ non-commercial part of it? Because really it's just about changing the remit, and you shut down the sales and marketing department and you just change that focus for the organisation.
Where does the money come from to keep it alive?
Apart from that, yes, that's a big
Sorry,
part. Apart from that.
But it's also not just the sales organisation. It has one finance department, one HR. If you're going to split these things up, you're going to start to duplicate cost into two separate
it's going to be more expensive.
You don't need to separate those things.
You should keep using it while it generates revenue. One day it will not be able to have advertising because the world is killing off commercial TV. So whilst it's still alive, you should all enjoy it.
Actually change that before it happens. Why wait to go up the cliff? Why not actually? See, I'm in a festival. I actually have audiences growing year on year. You guys are all having your audiences depleted. So my model is about cultural experiences, open access cultural experiences through photography in this region. My audience is growing, yours isn't. I run a charitable trust, so, you know, your model's wrong.
Well, I think that's part of the debate that we're having. I don't think there's any one solution we all agree on. Sorry, question at the back.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Matty Wall and I'm not a broadcaster, but I am a concerned citizen. Thank you to all the participants and the speakers, and particular thanks to Michael Stiassny for his comment. And I hope, to me, it was balm to the soul, because my concern about media in New Zealand is about the fact that people now don't seem to understand, particularly younger people, those of us who are not here, who are grey-haired and who take it as a given that public media is important and that news and current affairs is absolutely necessary for democracy. That is not a given outside the walls of this building. And what Michael has said is critical. It's more important than the how. And when I come to these discussions, idiotic and ignorant that I am, I hear people talking about the this and the that, and we could do this and we could that. I don't give a rat's ass. I don't care. I know I should, but I know that you people understand those things. I don't. But I care very much about this country. And I care mightily that for probably 20 years, if not a generation now, there is a whole bunch of people in positions of power, positions of growing power because of their age and their demographic, who know nothing about the world that I grew up in and in which I was informed regularly by media about the world that I live in. And you only have to think about, and I have got a question at the end of this, and I will make it short. I'm not going to rave on because too much longer. But you think about the top party last year and about Gareth Morgan's valiant effort to engage people in policy. And then, of course, he said in the end, when he didn't get where he wanted to get, oh, well, New Zealand is fat and complacent and they don't care about policy. Why should they? Where do they understand policy? How do they understand policy? And policy is not necessarily going to come out of investigative journalism, nor is it going to come out of news, but it will come out of good current affairs. We've got the platforms. What we don't have is the philosophy. So my question, sorry that I've got round to it so long-windedly, but my question, which I don't expect an answer to now from the Better Public Media Trust, is will you hear what Michael Stiassny has said? And will you please not focus on the how, but focus on the why it matters, because that is the challenge for us and those of us who care about, is to convince to the generation below who don't know about why it matters and tell them and make a case, an absolutely indelible case about why it matters for the health of this country. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm aware that we're running out of time. Some of our illustrious speakers have flights to catch, so maybe we have time for one more question.
I don't really have a question, but I'd like nothing on the spot. We have got some younger members of the audience here. I think they should have opportunity to say something.
Would you like to comment?
I don't know. I think what you said about the age discrepancy is really important, and I feel like no one else here, I guess, aside from you, because you're like a completely different department kind of thing, has really taken that into account. Like, young people don't really care about TV, and like, yeah, why should we care about TV? We might be like the last generation that really grew up with TV, and people younger than us, like, yeah, they're
None
probably,
of us have TVs in our homes.
yeah, like we don't have TVs. Like, you don't have a TV in your house.
55% of the population, millennials or younger, and 15% of the population are over 50. The majority of people in this room are an exceedingly small minority.
So how do you equate that with the research that New Zealand On Air did, which shows such large numbers watching linear TV?
I don't.
I mean, because Mark, you questioned that. You don't believe it?
No, I don't believe it. I know my own patterns. I know my own children's patterns. I know all my peers and colleagues. We don't watch free-to-air TV.
Take Maori TV, best example in the world. It's meant to be around, sorry, I think ignorantly, to foster te reo. Its population market, its target market is 15 to 30, give or take. We know that those people don't watch linear TV. What's Maori TV? It's a linear TV.
It's got an on-demand platform.
Sorry?
It's got an on-demand platform.
Oh.
And they're on Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's why the discussion of linear TV, it comes down to the brand. Like, the brand needs to be malleable and be able to move online, because that is absolutely where the audience is. As the audience gets older, as we age in New Zealand, it's going to be towards online, it's not towards linear. So it needs to be adaptable.
TVNZ's online offerings have become amazingly over the last 12 months.
Yeah, they're on-demand services, yeah.
The thing is that that research was done. They went and asked ordinary people. Now, they didn't go to the urban elites, which is how you could class some of the people in this room, much of the people in this room, and they should went and quantitatively asked people how they get their media. Now, who are we to say that's wrong? Do we know better because of the people we know, or is that research bunk?
What's happening is the television system is evolving, so the question we should ask is, what will television look like? And clearly it's going to be less linear, we know that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that television as a medium is going to, spectacularly decline. It just means that our modes of reception and the technologies of distribution are going to change.
One more person uses the word linear TV. What the hell is it? What do you mean by linear TV?
Oh, TV1, TV3.
Episodic.
When you watch things,
Live television with
linear
a schedule.
schedule.
Live television with a schedule. So if you have a TV and you're tuning in to watch TV1 live or TV2, as opposed to TVNZ On Demand, where you're watching.
It seems to be an academic term.
No, it's
I don't understand. I've never heard of it.
Everything online is narrowcasting, it's not actually broadcasting.
Well, in terms of signal reception, it is. So, well, look, I think we've reached the point where we're going to have to close. So, a very, very big thank you to all our speakers for taking the time to come and inform the debate. So, let's show our appreciation. Thank you very much.